I still can't sleep properly after what happened to me 3 weeks ago, and I keep thinking maybe sharing this here will help me process it somehow. I've been driving trucks for 15 years, seen all kinds of crazy stuff on the road, but nothing prepared me for that night on I-94 just outside Chicago. I was hauling a load of pharmaceuticals from a distribution center in Milwaukee down to a hospital network in Indiana. Nothing too unusual for me, since I do that route pretty regularly. The load was worth probably close to 200 grand, mostly pain medications and antibiotics, the kind of stuff that's been getting targeted more and more lately, according to the company briefings. I remember thinking about that as I was driving, how they'd been warning us drivers to be extra careful with pharma loads. But honestly, I figured it was just corporate being overly cautious. The weather was decent for late October, not too cold yet, and traffic was lighter than usual since it was past rush hour. I was making good time and feeling pretty relaxed, had my usual country music station playing, and was planning to grab dinner at this truck stop I knew about an hour south. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was to think it would just be another normal run. The whole thing started around 8:30 p.m. when I was about 20 miles past the city limits, right in that stretch of I-94 where there's not much around except farmland and those scattered gas stations every few miles. That part of the highway has always given me the creeps, especially at night, because it's so isolated and you hear stories about trucks getting hit by thieves out there. I was in the right lane doing about 65, staying with the flow of traffic, when I noticed this dark sedan in my mirrors that seemed to be pacing me. At first I didn't think much of it, because cars do that sometimes. Maybe the driver's using my truck to gauge their speed or whatever. But after about 10 minutes, the car was still there, staying exactly the same distance behind me, and that's when I started to feel uneasy. I tried changing lanes to see what the car would do, and sure enough, it followed me over to the left lane and maintained that same distance. My heart started beating a little faster, because in all my years of driving, I've learned to trust my gut when something feels off. I grabbed my CB radio to see if any other drivers were around, but the channel was pretty quiet, except for some chatter way off in the distance. The car had tinted windows, so I couldn't make out how many people were inside or what they looked like, but there was something deliberate about the way it was following me that made my skin crawl. I decided to test my theory by slowing down to about 55, figuring if it was just a coincidence, the car would pass me and move on. Instead, it slowed down to maintaining that exact same distance behind my trailer. That's when I knew for sure I was being followed, and my mouth went completely dry. I started thinking about all the horror stories other drivers had told me about getting robbed or carjacked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to become one of those stories. I reached for my cell phone to call dispatch, but of course I was in one of those dead zones where there's barely any signal, just one bar that kept flickering in and out. The nearest exit was still about 8 miles ahead, and I started doing the math in my head about whether I should speed up and try to outrun them, or just keep going steady and hope they'd lose interest. My hands were getting sweaty on the steering wheel, and I kept checking my mirrors every few seconds, watching that car like a hawk. The worst part was not knowing what they wanted or what they were planning. Just sitting there waiting for something to happen, while my imagination ran wild with all the terrible possibilities. Then, without any warning, the car suddenly accelerated and slammed right into the back of my trailer. The impact wasn't huge, but it was hard enough to jolt me forward in my seat and make my coffee cup go flying across the cab. My first instinct was to think it was just an accident. Maybe the driver had fallen asleep or something. But then it happened again, about 30 seconds later. Another deliberate hit to my rear bumper. This time, I knew it wasn't an accident, and my adrenaline just exploded through my system like nothing I'd ever felt before. The car was ramming me on purpose, trying to get me to pull over, and suddenly, everything clicked into place about what was happening. I grabbed my CB radio and started calling for help, shouting my location and saying I was being attacked. But I don't know if anyone heard me clearly, because my voice was shaking so bad. The third hit was even harder, and I could hear something scraping against my trailer, probably their front bumper getting damaged, but they didn't seem to care. I realized they weren't going to stop until I pulled over, and with my truck being so much bigger and heavier, I was worried about losing control if they kept ramming me at highway speed. The smart thing would have been to keep driving until I reached the next exit, but I was honestly terrified they might cause a serious accident that could kill someone, maybe even me. So I made what I now realize was probably the worst decision of my life. I started slowing down and put on my hazard lights, looking for a safe place to pull over. There was a wide shoulder area coming up near an overpass, with some decent lighting from the highway lamps, and I figured at least, if something bad was going to happen, maybe other drivers would see it and call for help. As soon as I started moving toward the shoulder, the ramming stopped, and the car backed off to give me room to pull over. That should have been another red flag right there. How organized and planned out their whole approach was. But I was still thinking maybe I could just exchange insurance information and get out of there quickly. I remember my hands were shaking so bad I could barely steer properly, and I kept telling myself to stay calm and just handle it like any other fender bender. When I finally came to a complete stop and put the truck in park, I sat there for maybe 10 seconds just trying to catch my breath and figure out what I was going to say to whoever got out of that car. I could see the car had pulled up behind me about 20 feet back, and their headlights were still on, making it hard for me to see anything clearly in my mirrors. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I remember thinking this was probably just going to be some road rage incident where the guy yells at me for a few minutes and then we both go on our way. I grabbed my logbook and insurance papers from the glove compartment and opened my door. Stepping down from the cab onto the shoulder, the asphalt was still warm from the day's heat, and I could smell that familiar highway smell of exhaust and rubber, mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I heard multiple car doors slamming behind me, not just one like I was expecting. When I turned around to look, my stomach just dropped through the floor because there were 4 guys walking toward me. Not just one angry driver like I'd been imagining. They were all wearing dark clothes and baseball caps pulled low over their faces. And something about the way they moved told me this wasn't going to be any normal accident discussion. The guy in front was bigger than the others, probably about my height but wider, and he had his hands in his jacket pockets in a way that made me think he might be carrying something. None of them said a word as they approached, which made the whole situation feel even more threatening, and I realized I was completely alone out there, with no way to get help quickly. I started backing toward my truck, thinking maybe I could get back inside and lock the doors, but I was moving too slow, and they were getting closer fast. That's when the biggest guy pulled his right hand out of his pocket, and I saw the metallic glint of what looked like a knife blade reflecting the highway lights. "Don't even think about getting back in that truck," the big guy said, and his voice was calm and steady in a way that scared me more than if he'd been yelling. He kept the knife low but visible, and I could tell this wasn't his first time doing something like this. The other 3 guys spread out around me in a semicircle, cutting off any chance I had of running toward the highway or back to my cab. One of them was younger, maybe early 20s, and he kept looking around nervously like he was watching for other cars, while another guy who looked Hispanic was staring directly at my trailer with this focused expression like he knew exactly what was inside. The 4th guy was shorter but stocky, and he had pulled out his phone and was either texting someone or taking pictures. I couldn't tell which. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if I should just give them my wallet and hope they'd leave, but something told me this was way more serious than a simple robbery. "We know what you're carrying back there," the big guy continued, nodding toward my trailer. And that's when I realized they hadn't just randomly picked me, they knew about the pharmaceutical load. My mouth went completely dry because I understood then that this whole thing had been planned out, probably for days or weeks. And I was just the unlucky driver who happened to be making this run tonight. The Hispanic guy walked over to the back of my trailer and started examining the lock on the rear doors, running his hands around the edges like he was looking for the easiest way to break in. "Heavy-duty lock," he called out to the others, "but nothing we can't handle." He pulled a small crowbar out of his jacket, and I watched in horror as he started working on the locking mechanism. Meanwhile, the big guy with the knife stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell cigarettes on his breath and see a scar running along his jawline. "Here's how this is going to work," he said quietly. "You're going to give us the keys to that trailer, and then you're going to sit down right here on the ground and count to 500 before you even think about moving. If you cooperate, nobody gets hurt, and you go home to your family tonight." The way he said it made it clear that the alternative wasn't something I wanted to find out about. I was thinking about my wife Sandra and my 2 kids back home, and how I'd promised my daughter I'd be at her soccer game this weekend, and suddenly none of the cargo seemed worth risking my life over. But I also knew that losing a load worth $200,000 would probably cost me my job, and we needed that income desperately with my son starting college next year. The whole situation felt completely surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else, instead of living through it myself. My hands were shaking as I reached into my pocket for the trailer keys, and I could barely get them out because my fingers felt like they belonged to someone else. The young guy who'd been acting as a lookout suddenly hissed, "Car coming," and pointed down the highway where I could see headlights approaching in the distance. For a split second I thought about yelling for help, but the big guy must have read my mind because he grabbed my arm and squeezed hard enough to make me wince. "Don't even think about it," he whispered, pressing the knife against my ribs just enough that I could feel the point through my shirt. The four of them stood perfectly still as the car passed by, and I watched those taillights disappear into the darkness, taking my best chance for help with them. As soon as the highway was empty again, the Hispanic guy got the trailer lock open with his crowbar, and the metal door swung open with a loud creak that seemed to echo off the overpass above us. I heard him let out a low whistle as he shined his phone's flashlight inside, and he called out "Jackpot," just like we thought. The big guy smiled for the first time since this whole thing started, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made my blood run cold. "You picked the wrong night to be carrying the good stuff," he said to me, like this was somehow my fault for just doing my job. The next 20 minutes felt like the longest 20 minutes of my entire life. I had to sit cross-legged on the shoulder of the highway, watching these guys systematically empty my trailer like they were professional movers. They had obviously done this before because they worked fast and efficiently, loading boxes of medications into their car with practiced movements. The stocky guy kept watch, while the other three did the heavy lifting, and every time a car passed by, they'd all freeze until it was gone. I kept thinking about how I was going to explain this to my dispatcher, to the insurance company, to my wife, and none of the scenarios I imagined ended well for me. The worst part was feeling so helpless, just sitting there while they stole everything I was responsible for delivering. They didn't take everything. I guess their car could only hold so much, but they definitely went for the most expensive stuff first. The pain medications and antibiotics that I knew were worth the most on the black market. I could hear them talking quietly among themselves, discussing which boxes to prioritize, and it was clear they knew exactly what they were looking for. At one point, the young lookout guy asked if they should take my personal stuff too, my wallet and phone, but the big guy told him no, said this wasn't about me, it was just business. That actually made me feel a little better, knowing they weren't planning to hurt me or steal my identity or anything like that. But I was still terrified about what would happen once they were finished. When they finally finished loading their car, which was sitting so low on its suspension I was amazed it could even move. The big guy walked back over to where I was sitting. I could see sweat on his forehead despite the cool night air, and his breathing was a little heavy from all the lifting. "All right, here's what happens next," he said, crouching down so he was at eye level with me. "You're going to sit here and count to 500, nice and slow, like 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, you know what I mean. If you get up before you reach 500, or if you try to call anyone before then, we're going to have a problem." He paused and looked directly into my eyes, and I could tell he meant every word he was saying. "After you hit 500, you can do whatever you want. Call your company, call the police, call your mother, I don't care. But you give us that head start, and everybody goes home safe tonight." The Hispanic guy was already in the driver's seat of their car, engine running, ready to go. The young lookout climbed into the back seat, and the stocky guy got in the passenger side after giving me one last threatening look. I nodded my head rapidly, probably looking pathetic, but I didn't care about my dignity at that point. I just wanted them gone so I could figure out what to do next. As their car pulled away from the shoulder and accelerated back onto the highway, I started counting just like the big guy had told me to. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, and so on. Even though part of me wanted to jump up immediately and call for help. But something about the way he'd looked at me made me believe he was serious about coming back, if I didn't follow his instructions exactly. The silence after they left was almost worse than when they were there, because now I was alone with the reality of what had just happened and what it meant for my life. My trailer was about half empty, with boxes scattered around, and the rear doors hanging wide open, and I knew I was looking at probably the end of my trucking career. The counting helped keep me focused and gave me something to do besides panic. But my mind kept racing ahead to all the phone calls I'd have to make, and all the questions I'd have to answer. When I finally reached 500, I stood up on shaky legs and walked back to look inside my trailer, hoping maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. But seeing the empty space where all those boxes used to be just made everything feel real in a way that hit me like a punch to the stomach. I pulled out my phone and saw that I finally had a decent signal again, and I just stared at it for a minute, not sure who to call first. Dispatch, the police, or my wife. I ended up calling 911 first, and when the dispatcher asked me what my emergency was, I honestly didn't know how to explain what had just happened. "I'm a truck driver, and I just got robbed," I said, but even saying it out loud made it sound unreal. The state police arrived about 15 minutes later, two officers who were professional but clearly skeptical about some parts of my story, especially when I described how organized and calm the robbers had been. They took photos of my trailer, dusted for fingerprints on the door handles, and wrote down everything I could remember about the car and the four men, but I could tell they didn't expect to catch anyone. One of the officers told me that pharmaceutical truck robberies had been increasing all over the Midwest, and that the thieves usually knew exactly which trucks to target and when they'd be on specific routes. That made me wonder if someone at the distribution center, or maybe even at my own company, had been feeding information to these guys. But I kept that thought to myself. The paperwork took over an hour, and by the time the police left, it was past midnight, and I was completely exhausted. I called my dispatcher and had to wake him up to report what happened, and he was surprisingly understanding. Probably because the company's insurance would cover most of the loss. But I knew this would follow me for the rest of my career, and I'd probably never get assigned to carry high-value loads again. The strangest part about this whole experience is how normal everything went back to being after that night. The police never caught the guys who robbed me, and as far as I know, they never even came close to finding them. My company did exactly what I expected. They took me off pharmaceutical runs permanently and put me on regular freight, stuff that's not worth stealing. The insurance company paid out the claim without too much hassle, which made me think this kind of thing happens more often than people realize. I still drive that same stretch of I-94 sometimes when I'm heading to Indiana, and every single time I pass the spot where it happened, I get this sick feeling in my stomach and start checking my mirrors obsessively. What bothers me most is how professional those guys were, like they'd done it dozens of times before and would probably do it dozens of times again. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, following other trucks, waiting for the right moment to strike, and I feel bad for whoever their next target might be. I've told this story to other drivers at truck stops, and more than a few of them have had similar experiences or know someone who has. It makes you realize that there's this whole criminal network out there that most people don't even know exists, targeting trucks full of valuable cargo on dark stretches of highway where nobody can help you. 3 weeks later, I still jump every time a car follows me for more than a few miles, and I probably always will.